Perfect. Okay, I'm just waiting for the recording to get kicked off. There we go. All right, welcome everybody. So today we are going to be talking about Agile, Scrum, and Source Control. All three of these are going to be very important concepts for you going into the working environment. Some of you might have already been introduced to some of this from a distance perspective. Some of you might already be working with Agile and Scrum. Hopefully Source Control is something that isn't new to you, but if it is, it's not a problem. We'll take you through some of the basics. The whole concept around source control is that it's going to rapidly increase the way that you use it now throughout the semester, as this is going to be the way that things need to work going forward, because from an industry perspective, source control is non-negotiable. It is one of the most important commodities that we have. So before we get kicked off with class, let's just go through some of the admin items first. So please, if you haven't joined the LinkedIn group yet, please join the LinkedIn group. The link is in last week's Prezzo as well as the end of this week's Prezzo. Same with the Microsoft form. If you haven't filled that in, please go fill that in as well. Then we will upload the scopes onto Fundi so that you can see what the project briefs are for the semester. So specifically around project 1, because project 1 is due first, but you're going to need the other projects as well to complete your project 1, just to understand what we're expecting from you. And also please take note of all the training that needs to be completed in each of those projects. Start building that into your plan for the semester. And then we've got another request from you. Please, can you set up your Azure accounts with student credits? And if you cannot claim those credits because you've used the accounts in a module previous to this one, please go complete the form that we've got on the slides. These slides will be made available on eFundi for you to go get the link and be able to complete the form. All right, and then the last perspective or the last point to this is that we are going to be covering a lot of work today. So please, if you are battling to keep up with what we're going through, please make sure you use the slides and the recording later on to break this up into smaller components and digest it in bite-sized chunks. All right, so first off, let's start with version control. Usually what happens is we are asked, what is version control? How does it differ from source control? And essentially, we're all guilty of this. I think we've all done it once or twice, where we give a really strange name to whatever file we're working on, and then whenever we want to create new projects, we just keep adding numbers or letters to the end of it. So essentially, version control is this, just a little bit more sophisticated, because there is actually a theory around it. So instead of naming it finally 6, we make it V6 1001.1. And each of these can be broken up into what essentially you're changing on the application. So if you're making a minor change, you'll update the third letter or the third number. If you're making a change that will impact the functionality or introducing a new feature into the solution, it would then change this middle number, and then a major release will then be the first number. So in essence, when we look at source control, what is that? Source control is essentially not this. It's not just naming a file and putting a version on it. It's actually storing your code somewhere. So when we talk about source control versus version control, it's kind of the same, but also different. What we mean by that is when we look at version control, essentially we're talking about what the concept is that we use to actually manage versions of the source control. So this is essentially, where you've now updated new versions, you've added it to your source control, and that actual changing of the versions is what we refer to version control. But the source control is separate in the sense that that is actually where we store our code. So making sure that our code is accessible from the cloud, making sure we've got a strategy in place, that is source control. So although they're used interchangeably, they don't mean the same things. And that's very important to understand, because when you start looking at tools and technologies that actually allow you to do this kind of work, you'll start to see the differences. So for instance, if you're looking at SharePoint or Dropbox, yeah, they do version control because they show you what changed in the versions of your documents, for instance, but that isn't necessarily what we use for source control. For source control, we've used what's on screen at the moment. So Git and TFS are usually the big ones that are used. TFS has a very long and very rich history behind it and works quite different from the way that TFS works. From the way that Git works. And Git is something that you'll find in most organizations being used now. And the reason for that is because Git actually comes with a branching strategy. So when you use TFS, you're actually using folders. So you're breaking out your code based on folders, and there's a lot of room for error there. Because when you're using Git, you can actually break out your code based on what you're developing what is a working feature, and then what is the overall solution looking like. And the way that you manage those branches is a lot more flexible than the way that you would do that in TFS. And that is why the industry has somewhat shifted. So when we start to look at the basics, the first thing that we want to learn to do when we're using Git is we want to learn how to init or clone a repository. Now, when we're cloning a repository, it means that the repository already exists on the cloud, and all we want to do is get that onto our local. When we're using init, essentially we want to initialize a new repository. So the way that this works, it looks a little bit complicated, but it really isn't. And the more you start using it, you'll see that this actually makes a lot of sense, and it makes your life a lot easier to do. So this is kind of bi-directional between the different stages or different phases of the process. The working directory essentially refers to your folder that you have on your computer. So if you're storing the folder on your desktop, that's going to be your working directory. That's going to be where your code lies. Then what happens is your code moves to a staging area, which moves to a local repository. So it's essentially now, a space on your local computer that is now prepared and synced up to the repository that is living online on cloud, that the data is then, or the source code is going to be shared back and forth between. So essentially what you want to do is you want to run the different commands to move the code that you have into the different areas before it moves onto the cloud platform. So essentially, when you start off and you've made changes in your environment, you're going to want to add that to the staging area, commit that to the local repository, and then push that to the remote repository. The remote repository is then what lives on cloud. If somebody's made changes to this remote repository and they've now done the whole process where they've added, committed, and pushed, then what you want to do is actually pull their changes onto your local. So this is now where you'll pull, git pull, and then get this onto your local machine. Git fetch and git merge work kind of hand in hand when you're working with people on a project. So when you're working with multiple people, you might be changing the same file, and then what ends up happening is you have merge conflicts. So usually what happens is before you pull a file, you fetch the file to see if there's any changes or merges. You can manage those merges and then go through the process of actually creating your push. So go and add, commit, push. If you're not working with people, or multiple people, and you're not working on the same files, then this becomes a little bit simpler because then you don't have merge conflicts. Merge conflicts can be very tedious to try, fix, and sort out, especially when you're working on the same lines of code and it's not just copy and paste and merge things in. So it is always important that this maps up to your planning strategy to make sure that you and somebody else in the team are not working on the same code at the same time. All right, so what we've now spoken about is essentially how you move code between your local and your cloud repository, but essentially what we want to look at as well as your branching strategies. So all of this git, add, commit, push situation, this would all run here on top of master until you start creating branches. When you start creating branches, you start going deeper into the different levels. So from master, you can create a develop branch, and if you're working multiple people on a project, each person would have their own develop branch, which would then be pushed to a feature branch. Change the feature, push it back up into develop, and once it's been tested, it goes back up into master. What would also happen is if you're running in a production environment and there's a bug that occurs, you can create a hotfix where you literally just create a hotfix branch, fix whatever the bug is, push it back up, and then continue. And as you can see here, this is now where the versioning comes in as well. So different organizations have different branching strategies. It very much does depend on the organization and the project that they're trying to solve. You'll find that bigger projects have much bigger branching strategies, whereas smaller, simpler projects tend to have very minimalistic branching strategies. Even if you are only one person on a project, it is a really good idea to have a develop branch so that you don't have to keep deleting and recreating repositories whenever you make mistakes. By removing that, or by creating a development branch or feature branches from your development branch, you can isolate the different pieces of code you're working on. You can test, you can try new things, and if you see that doesn't work, you just delete the branch. You don't have to delete all of the work that now is encapsulated into that. You've literally just got a small node of that project that you're deleting. So it is something important to consider and research and investigate. You'll see as you go through your research and your training, because we do want you to get some of the Git certifications, you'll see that there are different ways to implement branching strategies. And essentially the easiest way that would work for you, or what we would probably propose rather, is that you actually use a development branch. You can decide then if you want feature branches as well. All right, then if you need help and you don't understand what the different commands are, because essentially you can also have GUIs that do a lot of this work for you. So you can download front ends like GitHub Desktop. There's also SourceTree. There's quite a few different interfaces that you can use to interface with your Git repositories. But in essence, all of those interfaces run the same commands in the back end, and the process works exactly the same. So you have to add, then you either add or stage, depending on which user interface you use. Visual Studio also has a built-in interface. So in Visual Studio, it'll be stage instead of add, but you'd also need to commit and push. So the process works exactly the same, but to understand the underlying commands is going to help you a lot, because if you get to a client's environment where you can only use your command line prompt, you're going to need to know what the commands are. I know that there are quite a lot of devs in the industry that would rather use the command line prompt than use GUIs, because sometimes things get lost and it just gets a little bit messy. So it is a personal preference thing. We're not going to describe or tell you which GUIs or UIs to use to interact with Git. You can decide on that for yourself. We can make recommendations, but essentially every dev has their own preference. Okay, so something that I wanted to include in this, because we see this quite a lot in industry with grads coming in. For people who don't really understand how different technologies fit together, we do see that sometimes students mix up the technologies somewhat. So just as Java is not the same as JavaScript, Git is not the same as GitHub. GitHub uses Git, but it doesn't mean they're the same thing. So Git is the underlying technology. It's almost, if you think about it, as the language. If you're using C#, that's the language, but you're using Visual Studio to actually work with C#. And the same now applies to Git and GitHub. Git is almost like the underlying commands that you run, and then GitHub is the way that you interface with Git. All right, so we've got a few homework exercises for you. The first one is going to be to create your own code. So you need to create a public repository on GitHub, clone that to your computer, and then go create a README file that essentially just details what the problem is that you're trying to solve with the code that you're now putting into that repository, and then actually go apply that, go push all that code into the repository that you want to document. Then the second exercise is to actually create a development branch. So I've given you all the steps of actually putting in what the steps are to create the development branch, and you can go run through that. And then the third one is actually reuse existing code. So what we want you to learn here is how to actually go find cool things that people are doing on GitHub. There's quite a few really interesting things that people are doing. People have actually gone and created almost like satiric or really comedic takes on technology, where they take something like status codes and then go create new ranges of status codes. If you browse through GitHub, you'll also get a better sense of what has already been done by other people. So you can actually go take a look at seeing what there is that you can use. Fork that repository to your profile, clone it, and then contribute and put it into your local repository. The students who did this last year, we got some really good feedback. Some people actually said that the changes that they made to the repository, they pushed back into the repository that they forked from. And those changes were actually accepted, and it was a contribution that they made to the grander community. So, do this, take this on as a community engagement exercise. If you do end up having your contribution pushed back into the repository that you've cloned from, keep that. Take a screenshot of it and put it under your community engagement portion of your portfolio of evidence. All right, then we just need to update the link of that form, but essentially we want to make sure that all homework is submitted before the next class. I see the date is wrong as well, so I'll just go update that. But essentially all of your homework needs to be updated or uploaded before the next class. So I'll update the link and I'll update the date just before we put this on Ifundi. All right, then just before I move on to the rest of the content that we have, are there any questions? Guys, I just want to repeat, please don't put your student number and your initials into the chat, because we already have all of that information available. If you've logged in with your student's account, we can see all of that information. All right, any questions? Guys, I'm not sure if you're hearing me. I asked you to please not put them into the chat. Okay, cool. If there's no questions on source control and version control, I'm going to move over to Agile. So Agile essentially is what we refer to as a project management approach that is used within software development. And there are quite a few different types of project management. If you take the ISE module in your honors, if you're deciding to do honors with us next year, you'll see there are quite a few different strategies that can be implemented within the IT landscape. Agile at the moment is one of the most popular ones, along with Waterfall. There are quite a few others as well, but those are the two predominant ones that you'll find in an organization. So Waterfall essentially refers to a project management methodology where you've got very specific steps in the systems development lifecycle, the software development lifecycle, and you have to go through each of those steps, finish the solution in its entirety before you release into production so that you can actually get value. Whereas Agile works differently. Agile tries to create more lean process, or a more lean process, which still aligns to this software development lifecycle, but helps to deliver value a lot faster. So instead of developing your entire solution and putting it into production, you develop a portion that would add value and can be used standalone. You put that into the production environment. You enhance the next piece, put that back into the production environment. And through that process, you've essentially now created, let's say, 10 releases, where incrementally over the last 10 weeks, people have been able to deliver value or get value out of what you've delivered. Whereas in a waterfall fashion, that isn't realized. Only at the end of week 10 do you publish or deploy your code into production, because all the changes have only been implemented by then. So this is now the big change in philosophy. Agile isn't very easy to just pick up and run with. It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of time. So it is something that kind of goes hand in hand with change. It means that the organization that implements Agile needs to be very open to change. So that is essentially the big difference between the two. Now, when we look at Agile, this is essentially a way that we start looking at how we break up our work. And this is now where we start leaning on methodologies that live underneath Agile. So this is now where we look at Scrum, we look at Kanban, we look at SAFe, all of those different kinds of methodologies that help us actually define how to break up our work further. So what normally happens in an Agile environment is you'll have your backlog of work. So let's say you get a project. You know, there's a bunch of work that needs to go into this project. You'll usually align all of that work to your software development lifecycle. So you know you have to analyze the problem. You know you need to design a solution. You need to develop a solution, deploy the solution, and then support the solution. That's your end-to-end stack. Now, what happens is the tasks and the features and everything that you need to do essentially to actually make those pieces work, you put onto the backlog. Then what happens is that backlog of work is broken up into really high-level, very big pieces of functionality, and essentially these epics become projects on their own. So if you're looking at your semester, epic 1 would be project 1, epic 2 could be project 2, because essentially you're trying to solve different things. And then you break that up further and you've actually got features, and then you've got stories, and then you've got tasks and subtasks, and essentially you create this entire hierarchy of things that need to be completed and rolled up to show the level of success. Now, also depending on the methodology that you use, a story could relate to a piece of work, whereas in other instances, a task relates to a piece of work. So by the end of your 2-week iteration, depending on the methodology that you use, you should be able to show something for the work that's being completed under that story. And that then leads us to Scrum. So Scrum is one of many different components that you could essentially pick within an Agile framework. And essentially the kind of idea behind Scrum is that you use a bunch of ceremonies, tools, and roles to make sure that the team works quite well together to manage their work and actually take on the tasks that need to be done. So essentially, when you were in a waterfall environment, you would have had a project manager that tells you as a single individual will do this piece of work. You as a single individual will do this piece of work. Whereas now in Scrum, that gets taken away from the project manager and the team takes accountability for the work. So between the team, they need to divide, the work based on capacity, based on skill set, so on and so forth. So the team then, the big shift in mindset is that the team takes accountability for the work. And if you're only one person in that team, obviously the accountability is still yours. So the ceremonies are also a way to start helping the team actually reflect on how to work better together. So some of those ceremonies could include planning, stand-up, review, retrospective, and then actually going into the next sprint. So planning is now usually done on the first day of the sprint. A sprint is usually about 2 weeks long. And what would happen here is you've actually got the board with a backlog and you show what you're taking into the sprint. So if you're working for 2 weeks, you can say essentially one person, let's say 8 hours a day that you're working, times the 10 days that you're working, you've essentially got 80 hours of work that you can fit into that sprint. So you make sure that the work that you take in does not exceed 80 hours. So you actually plan how long that work is going to take you. You plan how much you can bring in, and you put it within the realm of what you can actually achieve. Then you've got stand-up, which essentially happens every day. So it's a very short 15-minute meeting where you just say what was done since the last stand-up, what will be done by the next stand-up, and what the blockers are. Now, you'll see there that we say there's usually 8 days or 8 stand-ups in a sprint. And the reason for that is because when you have planning, that generally in almost like a safe or Scrum fashion, they would remove stand-ups from the first and the last day of the sprint, because the first day you've got planning and the last day you've got your retrospective and review. So when you remove those two, then you've got eight days essentially that you're going to be doing stand-ups for. Then you've got a review where you actually review the progress that you've made in the sprint. You close off your tasks. You see how many tasks you did manage to finish and how many tasks you need to take over to the next sprint. And essentially, you know, when you plan retrospectively for an entire semester, which is something you need to consider for project one, when you plan retrospectively, you want to take into account how much work you can fit into the different sprints that you have. Now, based on that work that you can actually take in, you want to know what the impact is going to be of moving some of the tasks out to the next sprint, because that's going to put you under more pressure when you know you've got deadlines. So that is something that is very important for each and every one of you to do. Then with that comes a retrospective. So this is now also being able to reflect back on the last sprint that you've now just executed on, and actually talk about, you know, what worked well, what didn't work well, what can be improved. Taking those items into the next sprint and actually trying to improve on whatever didn't go well. This was how we saw that a lot of students battled with time management last year. They didn't plan properly, so time management was a big issue. They only started, you know, developing 3 days before the due date. And guys, believe it or not, we can actually see that. So we have scripts in the background that run on your submissions to see when you started your work. Based on when you make commits to GitHub, we've got scripts that go scroll GitHub and actually go get all of that information for us. So we can see the progress that you're making on your project. And that's something that we need you guys to consider as well, you know, because the sooner you start working on the project, the more progress you make, the less pressure you're putting yourself under from a time perspective. So a lot of that stuff starts to come through in the retrospective. So it's important not just to do a retrospective and forget that all of that stuff was said, but actually take those items into the next sprint for the next project and think about how you can do it better and how you can improve on some of those items. All right, then sprint planning is essentially what starts off really well. Everybody's very ambitious, and then by the end of sprint review, it's been a really tough sprint. You've come across things that you didn't really know you were going to encounter, and by the end of it, you're feeling a little bit defeated. And usually the retrospective helps, you know, motivate you and put you in the right direction, because as much as you're going to feel along the semester that, you know, the projects are difficult and, you know, you're really struggling, there will also be a sense of achievement of getting it right. And we've seen this across some of the other students as well. You know, there's nothing more fulfilling than when you have a problem, you solve that problem that you didn't think you'd be able to solve, and then you can actually, you know, be encouraged and motivated to keep solving problems because you've now jumped a hurdle that, you know, previously looked really difficult to jump. So retrospective offers you that opportunity to not only look back on the negative, but very much use the positive to encourage you as well. Then the next portion is actually trusting the process. So I've showed you now what waterfall looks like. You've got a bunch of bad dev, and then it goes into production, and then everything works. If you're doing bad agile, essentially you're going to have, you know, really big issues that kind of just heap up and keep heaping up until you can get to a point where it's stable because it's now been implemented. But if you do real agile and you do agile properly, you'll have an issue, you'll fix it. You'll have an issue, you'll fix it. And so incrementally, you can add value. So by the time you get to November here, you've already got all of this value over here that you've managed to achieve. So this is now a process. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a lot of practice and it takes a lot of maturity to actually get from here to here, which I'm pretty sure you'll see between projects. But trust the process. If you take the agile methodology really seriously and you implement it, you know, continuously, you eventually do get to a point where you can actually realize a lot of value quickly. All right, so I've already spoken very shortly about what a sprint is. Essentially, this is usually 2 weeks. It's a time boxed period in which you actually need to complete a set amount of work. And it really is the heart of Scrum. This is essentially, you know, smaller pieces that allow you to, or smaller blocks that you have within your methodology that help you evaluate how much work you can do and essentially what you didn't do. So the whole point of Agile is if you've made a bad decision, you need to be able to roll back from the bad decision really quickly. Whereas in a waterfall environment, you'll really only notice the impact of that bad decision when you go live. So sprints, and that's why we say it's the heart of the methodology, because they help you make those decisions a lot faster than you would have if you were using a different methodology. Then Kanban is essentially something quite interesting. This was actually created by Toyota, if I'm not mistaken. And Kanban is a Japanese word that refers to a visual board or a sign, and we'll go through what those boards look like in a bit. I'll do a bit of a demo. But essentially how Kanban differs from Scrum is that you actually have work in progress limits that you apply. So what ends up happening is you say that your work in progress limit is 5 items, which means that you can only ever have 5 items in progress. Until you start finishing up those items that are in progress, you can't add more items in progress. That's kind of the work in progress limit. You can't do more than that because you need to try and optimize your delivery. If you have 15 or 20 tasks in progress, it's really difficult to measure what you are doing, what you can do, what you can't do. And when you have all of your work in progress and you haven't finished all of your work, it's really difficult to kind of split out what work was done in this sprint and what work needs to be moved over to the next sprint. That's why we try to say that you need to move over a task, work on the task, finish the task, then take the next one. Especially when you're starting out with Agile, that's a really good way to do it. So this is essentially what a Kanban board looks like. You'll have a bunch of columns, which essentially would look different depending on the team and how they're working with the whole methodology, if I can put it that way, because some teams will have a backlog, then they'll have a to-do in progress done. Some people will have a testing column in between, but essentially the big thing here with Kanban is this work in progress limit. So 3 out of 4 things have been moved into progress. You can't have more than 4 things in progress until something moves into the done state. All right, then some of the principles from Kanban perspective. This is purely here just so that you can understand, what we're trying to achieve with Agile. But essentially what you want to do is you want to start with what you do know. And you want to start with that now. So as soon as you know what you're starting with, you can plan for that and you can go from there. There will always be incremental change that needs to happen, and that's essentially what you're bringing to the different sprints through your planning. You always want to encourage that you've got leadership at all levels that actually buy into this methodology, because if there isn't buying, it tends to fall apart. And then there are a few service delivery principles as well. So let's take a look at a use case, and then I can show you a demo of how this works. Let's say we need to create a solution that needs to be accessible via the web. And this solution needs to allow users to actually create, read, update, and delete information, let's say about appliances that they keep in their home. So let's now say that we're working with an insurance company and they want to understand which items need to be added for additional insurance coverage. Now we need to make sure we apply the full SDLC, like I said earlier, analysis, design, development, implementation or deployment, and then support. We need to make sure we're looking at that whole life cycle and then actually, building this functionality as well. So some of the steps that we're looking at, like I said, that we've got the analyze, we've got the design, we've got the develop. Testing is also important. Some organizations actually build that into their development cycles, others not so much. So it does depend on the team. And then deploying and supporting. Those are the SDLC steps. What sometimes happens is organizations or teams will actually make those their features. In other cases, they'll kind of break that up a little bit more and make the features more intuitive. So you're actually looking at planning, you're looking at requirements gathering as part of analysis. The designing, you're trying to, actually build your design. Part of the development lifecycle or part of development, you'd actually have your source control set up. You'd create your functionality for the create, read, update, delete, so on and so forth. Those are the features. They're very high level. In between, you can still create stories. So depending on the methodology, this could be a feature, this could be a story. It really just depends on the way that you kind of work as a team or decide to do this as a team. And then tasks are the very granular details. This is essentially where you associate hours. This is what you estimate, so that all of this rolls up into your stories and your features. But creating a GitHub project, let's say that's going to take you half an hour. Creating a repo, another half an hour. You know that those 2 items together will take you an hour. So if you're putting that into something here that essentially says set up GitHub, you know that your story is going to have an hour of effort associated because of the 2 tasks that are connected to it. Creating your initial commit, your database design. These are very, very detailed things. These are the tasks are essentially what you're going to put hours against. All right, so I'd like you to please go onto your browser. If you've got your phone with you, take a picture of the QR code on the screen, please. I just want to see if I can get you the link quickly so that I can paste that in the chat for those of you who want to use that instead. Please just take a few minutes quickly to answer the quiz questions, just so that we can see what your understanding is of the content that we've now shared with you. And then once we're done with that, I will show you what is going on from a demo perspective. I'm just going to give you a few seconds to do that. If there are any questions in the meantime, please feel free to drop them in the chats. Okay, I see people are starting to use the forms. Okay, great. I see we've got quite a few responses coming in. So guys, please, interact with the form. It is also going to be a way that we actually measure, your engagement in the class, making sure that you're actually engaging, partaking, that you're not just sitting on the call, listening to us just to get your attendance mark. This is valuable for you as well, and for us to see that you're actually applying the knowledge that we're sharing with you. All right, I'm going to give you another minute or so just to complete that up. See, we've got 30 responses so far. Okay, so I see we've got quite a few different answers here. So we've got about 87 responses. So I'm just going to walk you through the responses, and then we can go through to the demo. So in essence, the first question is work in progress limits can be applied to Agile. Pretty much about 89% of you said that was true, and that's the correct answer. False, I'm not quite sure where you guys got to that, but essentially work in progress limits, that is applied very much to Kanban, which can be applied to the greater Agile methodology. Then the next question that we had was which project management methodology states that all components of the solution should be created before the solution can be, and or can be deployed rather. And most of you got it right with waterfall. Agile and Scrum work very different in comparison because they're pretty much polar opposites. So that's kind of the big difference between the two. And then the third question was source control and version control. Are they exactly the same concepts? And 77% of you said that they aren't, which is correct. So well done, guys. Thank you for participating. I think what we can do now is move over to the demo. So let me just quickly switch screens and then get that back up. Just give me a second quickly, please. Okay, so the demo that I'm going to be showing you is going to be a GitHub demo. And it's going to be to show you how to create the project. So I'm not going to go into the detail of showing you exactly how to create the project and do it exactly the same way that project one was or should be done. I'm going to leave that very much up to you to kind of use what I'm showing you today and go from there. So let's take a look. Prof, could you maybe just confirm that you can see my screen, please?
Yes, I can see you.
Brilliant, thank you. All right, so let's take this example that we were working with over here, where we've got the use case of the insurance company that we need to work with. And we now want to go into GitHub. Maybe let me go back one step for those of you who haven't really seen GitHub before. So this is essentially what GitHub looks like. You've got a bunch of repositories where you store your code. So there's a lot of code that you can pull from different places and actually work on and then send back. And then there are projects that you can create as well. So as you can see, there are quite a few projects that we did from last year. We've got some personal projects up here as well, so on and so forth. There's a projects tab and there's a projects classic. Don't use projects classic, only use projects because project classic has a lot less functionality in it. Projects are essentially grouped. You can use them to group a bunch of repositories. So you can have multiple repositories associated to a project and vice versa. All right, so let's start by creating a project and let's name this CMPG323 Insurance Company. And essentially what happened here is they actually allow you with quite a few options. So you can create a table first off, you can create a board, you can create a roadmap. Roadmap is new, or you can create a team backlog or feature backlog. So if you wanted to, you can go with the backlog feature first. As you can see, there's a few things that they create for you. They've got a board and then they've got a few tables as well. The feature looks slightly different in the sense that you've got a table and then a few boards that go along with it as well. So you can either start from scratch or you can select a template. Just make sure that what we've asked for in project one, you've applied throughout. So in essence, this is now what a Kanban board looks like. So you can see here, there's a lot of different columns you can go up to. You can change the columns. You can pretty much go into settings and add and remove columns as you please. But essentially, they've got new items which they need to be accepted onto the backlog. So just because there are items that have been listed doesn't mean that the team necessarily can do all of that, which means it doesn't necessarily go into the team's backlog. So some places do actually add new as well, just so that it shows what has been approved and what hasn't. And then you've got the backlog, which essentially gets groomed and then, it gets moved over to a ready state. Once it's in a ready state, which is almost like a to-do state, it then moves into in progress. This can either then be in review or in testing and then moves over to done. So what would happen is if you create a card, this is essentially a task that you would create. So let's say we have create GitHub repository or project because we're starting with the project. The way that this works is it's now gone into the new column. We've now accepted this into the backlog, which means that the team actually needs to create this. We go into a planning session. We say, okay, this needs to come into the sprint. This then moves into the ready state. Once it's actually been started, it goes into in progress, which is now what we're busy with. It's still in progress, so let's leave it there for a second and let's just duplicate the tabs so we can go see some of the back-end data that we've got in the other tabs, and then we'll come back to finish it off. So priority, we've only created one task. You can see who the assignees are. So this is now if you're working in a team of people, you can actually add who those team of people are. This will pull through from who you've shared the project with and who the repository owners are. You can set up a priority, so you can see that in the template this is already set up, so you can match or move the priority of your work based on this over here. So for instance, while you're planning your work, maybe go add some priority. You'll see some of the projects we've given do have priority, some of them don't, and you can actually use that to see what is critical to your project and what isn't. What can your project function without and what can't it function without? You can put your size down. So this generally is effort in hours or effort in size. Depending on the methodology that you're using, you might use chunks to actually kind of associate hours. So tiny might be like 0.5 hours, which is half an hour. One might be 1 hour. Medium might be 2. Large would be 4. And X large would be 8. There are methodologies like Scrum and SAFe that actually use the Fibonacci sequence. So you work in points where you go, you've got 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, so on and so forth. But the common rule is that as soon as you have a task that is going to take you more than 5 hours, you split it out into 2 tasks. So you try make your tasks as small and as granular as possible so that they're actually doable. And if you need to move them over to the next sprint, you don't have incomplete work that you're moving over. So essentially, at the end of the day, you're trying to get to a point where you can actually put this into bite-sized chunks and you can actually associate hours to them somehow, because then you can actually realistically say what you can and can't achieve in a sprint. If there are linked pull requests, which is something we'll get to in one of the later sessions, but if you work with pull requests, you can link that up. You can create labels in your repository and convert this to an issue and then actually pull those through. All right, so then we've got by size. So you can actually see if you had more statuses here, it groups them by size. So you can look at tiny. If we had more, let's say small, medium, large, that'll all be listed here as categories that you could then open up. But what we actually want to do is we want to create a table to manage our columns. So now we've got just a few columns in here which show our very high level information. But what we actually want to do is create some new columns or fields as well. So let's add story, let's add feature, let's add epic. Oops. and let's add hours effort. So you can either associate that and actually create a calculated field, or what you could do is create, kind of logic off of what you've already put in from a sizing perspective, or just create a new column. So the story perspective, let's say that the story over here is going to be to create or set up GitHub. And the feature is going to be, let's say, development. The epic is going to be project 1 or insurance project. Yeah, this is going to be really small because now we're actually saying what this detail is going to be, what this task detail is. So that, let's say, is going to take 0.5 hours. Then we've got create repository. And we can set up all of that information in a bit, but essentially this would remain the same. Check if we can paste all of these. All right, then let's move over to something else. So let's go into something like designing the database. Design database. Or draw ERD if you really wanted to. This would then be part of your design. Or the story itself would be database. Or we could probably use design still as well. Let's just remove that. Design. And this would also be design. So you can have a story and a feature that are more or less the same. So we could probably do this as data design, where you've actually got your database, your flows, all those kinds of things would then form part of your data design. If you wanted to, you could make this conceptual design, because in systems analysis and design, there are different ways of actually designing the solution. So you can have your conceptual design and your physical design. So if you really wanted to, you could actually make this conceptual design as a story instead of the data design. Epic is still the insurance project, and then you can have the hours here. Let's say this takes about 4 hours. All right, so now what I want to show you is that you've got 3 different tasks that are associated to 2 different stories, 3 different features, essentially. Well, this is actually still development. So 2 different features, but all to the same epic. So you can start to see how this hierarchy looks, right? You've got insurance project as your epic. You've got your 2 features, which is development and design at this point. And then you've got your stories, which now go down below all of those as well, that you've got your detail around as well. So now we've got our hours that are associated. If we go back to the different tabs, you'll see that this automatically populates. You can see that the priority, we've got no priority over here, but we've got urgent over here. And then we've got the backlog item. So this is now being associated to no status. So what we would then do is bring these into new. We're in a planning session. We've approved these that go into this sprint. So let's say that we only want GitHub repository to come into the sprint. We're ready to start it. We haven't started it yet. But now we need to go actually associate some of the statuses and priorities to it. So let's do that. We know that this one is actually quite high priority. It's also sized as a really small piece of work. And it's also associated to the same dev. So let's go see how that impacts the Kanban board. As you can see, all of this is linked, so it changes as you change it in the different views. It's all using the same underlying data. So that all updates as it goes along. If we look at the size quickly, you can see here that we've got database design, which is still in no size, but we've got both of these in tiny. And then the view has stayed more or less the same, just with the updated information. What is really important is that you rename your views. So you can say detailed view. This is important so that if there's any data that you need to change on these cards, you can kind of add all of your fields here, and you can actually see what's going on. So let's just add all of these in. And then what's most important here is you actually need to save. So if you see there's a blue dot there, it means you haven't saved. If you haven't saved and you submit your work and we can't see it, there's nothing we can do. We can only mark off of what we've seen. So please make sure you save your work the whole time, even though it is online. If you don't have if there's a blue mark, it means that it's not saved. So just save your work. You'll be able to see everything that's going on here. If you go back to the backlog, you'll see everything's updated, everything's changed. And for all intents and purposes now, let's say we've created the project. We're happy with the way that it's working, so we put it into review. At this point, generally, you can create some logic in the backend to actually associate it to a reviewer. If there's code associated, there's pull requests that can come in, and you can do code review using the pull request, where you actually associate somebody else to actually look at the code and then approve or reject the code. So this works hand in hand with the source control, which is why we're using this specifically this semester, because it's one of the very few platforms where your code and your planning can live in the same place, where your code can actually be linked up to your tasks, and you can say, this piece of code was actually for this task, and you can actually start moving things around like that. What's really cool in Visual Studios, and I'll show you this in one of the later classes as well, I'll create a video about it, is there's very specific things in Visual Studio where you can say this method actually relates to this piece of work, which is really cool because there are other tools that don't really allow you to do that. Okay, so now let's say we're all happy with this. There's quite a bit of additional functionality that you can actually introduce here. So you can create new or pretty much import repositories, you can create code spaces, you can create organizations, there's a bunch of stuff that you can do. But essentially what you can also do is you can create charts. So if you navigate to Insights, you'll see there's already a status chart that exists. So based on the items that you already have, this automatically populates. You've got one new type or one new item, you've got one item in ready, and you've got one item in review. Priority, you've got two items that are tiny and one that is no size. But you can also create a new chart where you actually now give it a name, which we'll do in a bit, but let's first figure out what we actually want to show here. So you can configure your chart. There's a bunch of different ways that you can show this. So let's say you want to show this, let's say by size. We've already got a size chart in status, I think. I'm not sure, we'll see now. But you can actually group it as well. So we can group the status by size, so you can see what the status is, or all the other way around, you can actually do status by size. And then you can either do a count of items or you can sum a field. So if you're using hours, you can actually then sum your hours, which is really cool as well. So if we break this up, you'll see now that you've got one new item, which is, or one that doesn't have a size, but you've got one that's ready, that's tiny, and one that's in review. But check now what happens if you switch these two around. And this is actually quite important because last year we saw a lot of students, just kind of put the stuff onto a graph. You'll see that this is part of your project one. They kind of just put stuff onto a graph, but they didn't really, it didn't really show the value that it was supposed to. And what you really do need to do while you're doing this is actually understand what information you're reading from your graph. And this is also going to lead on to your project right at the end where we actually look at reporting. So you want to understand now, I've created this graph. What does this graph tell me? Okay, it tells me that I've got new items, I've got items in ready, I've got items in review, and those are the colors, right? So we've got orange over here, which is the new item. We've got green, which is ready. We've got the review over here, which is blue. This shows us that we have two items that are tiny sized and one that it doesn't have a size associated. So what we can actually do now is name the chart appropriately. So essentially what we're trying to do here is we're measuring the status, the size by status. Count of items by size and status. So there's different ways to actually show what you're illustrating, but essentially that is pretty much how you go about understanding what the graph is trying to achieve. All right, so that's your Insights tab. You can pull some really cool and useful items from here. If you're in a sprint view, what's really nice is you can actually build a burn down chart. So burn down charts are really nice in the sense that if you know you've only got 80 hours available for a sprint and you've got 120 hours of work associated to that sprint, you can see you've got 40 hours more than what you need. So as you're going along with the sprint, your hours decrease because the days that you have left in the sprint decrease. And the burn down chart actually shows you how that decreases and how your work amount or the amount of hours that you have associated in work decreases with that. And essentially what you're trying to do is match those two up as closely as possible because you don't want to have more work than what you can achieve. Otherwise, you're going to be moving things out. I hope that makes sense. So guys, that's a very basic overview of what GitHub does and what we're going to be expecting from a GitHub project perspective for project one. I would suggest that you go through the recording if what I've said doesn't make sense. I've gone through a really, really small POC. I'd like you or really a demo. I'd like you to take the slides and kind of break it up further and see if you understand what I'm trying to achieve. Go take a look at what project one scope is and then start to break it out. And if you have any questions, let us know. Are there any questions right now? I just want to get the slides back up, but in the meantime, are there any questions that anybody has right now? I'll give you a few moments to put it into the chat just while I migrate through the slides. All right, any questions? Are we planning in project one for all other projects? Yes, that is the idea. So what we want to do with project one, and the reason we give you these projects is to show you how logically these projects will build across the semester. We want you to use project one to plan your semester out. If you know time management is going to be an issue and you know that you've got the schedule for all the other modules that you have, make sure that you plan the semester according to what you can achieve. Know that how many hours you are going to put down. We know that you're working on a 160 hour roughly for this. You have 160 hours for this module. It's a 16 credit module, so you know more or less how the sprints are split up. We split in sprints up in 2 weeks per sprint. That is on the schedule, so the schedule should be on Ifundi, and we'll show you how that kind of moves across. But in essence, what we want you to do is take the detail in the projects. Go take a look at the projects first, because you'll see we've broken a lot of that up into feature stories and tasks for you. So what you need to do is take that information, figure out what you need to do above and beyond that, add more tasks, because what we've put down doesn't necessarily cover all the tasks, but go figure out what the badges are that you need to get, figure out what the certifications are that you need to get, where the training fits in. Go figure all of that out and put it into your plan so that you can see throughout the semester how you're tracking on that plan. The idea is that you're not just going to submit project one and be over and done with it. I can't stress this enough. Project one is something that you need to use throughout the semester. You're going to be evaluated on project one in each and every single project, because what we want you to do is use project one throughout the semester to show us how you're incrementally adding value or gaining value from your planning. How are you adjusting your planning? How are your retrospectives influencing what you're doing throughout the semester? This is a really nice opportunity for you to start learning how to implement this with us here to guide you and help you, so that by the time you get into industry and you're expected to run with this methodology, you can already understand how some of these components fit together. So please make sure that you look at this. Start looking at, the training that you need to do. I see there's one comment here, but we don't really know what's going on in the other projects. So go take a look at what is happening in the PDFs. They should all be uploaded onto Ifundi. If they aren't, they'll be uploaded shortly after the class. But in essence, what we want you to do is go understand what is happening there first. Go look at what we're expecting. Go check what training you need to do to understand what is happening in those projects. You don't necessarily need to understand the full scope. You don't need to understand, everything that we're doing. If you put time in for the class and you want to put in time for upskilling and training, do that. We encourage that. Put in the time that you think you need to be able to prep to be able to do those projects. And then, you can start kind of emphasizing and kind of rejigging that plan every 2 weeks when you do your sprint planning. Then we see here, do courses have to be completed before starting the project? I would prefer that, yes, Brian. So it's a really good idea if you do the training, either before or while you are doing the project, so that you can understand how the components fit together. If you leave the training till the end, it's kind of useless because then you didn't need it. So definitely try to do that before you start with the project. Then Koki asks, would it be a good idea to use GitHub with our school accounts or the personal ones we have? This is up to you. So the way that I look at this is that if these are projects that you're going to be using to show your employers one day, or your potential employers while you're looking for work, I would definitely suggest putting it on your personal GitHub. If you're going to be updating and enhancing these projects, start building your profile for what you want to put out in there in industry. If you want to use this pretty much purely just as a project kind of thing that you just need to get done to get your marks, you're welcome to use the school accounts, but just remember then, one day if those school accounts get lost or disappear or are deprecated, you lose essentially the GitHub access. Then Ivan says, regarding certifications and badges, how should we showcase the completion of a free Udemy course, taking into account that free courses do not provide certifications? So just a screenshot of course completion will suffice. Put that into a Word document for us. We are busy working on your portfolio of evidence structure, essentially. So we're hoping to make that available to you not too long from now. And then essentially you can start populating that. The best advice I can give you for your portfolio of evidence right now is take screenshots of everything that you do. Put it into a Word document. As soon as you get your template, you can then start populating them. As soon as you start adding or essentially filling out our Word documents, or our Microsoft Forms, we will take that information and populate that into your portfolio of evidence. And that kind of leads on to the question we have about how do we add project one into our portfolio of evidence. So for project one, you're going to submit that as a project. We're then going to take that project, we're going to take the marks that you've submitted, we're going to take your retrospective, and we're going to put that into the portfolio of evidence for you, because we'll have access to your retrospective because you have to fill in a form for us for that. You'll have submitted project one, so we have access to that. So we're going to try to do some of the pre-work for you. If you submit it, we'll try add it into the document and then make that document available for you to see, what the progress looks like and so on and so forth. We just need some more time to finish putting that solution together, and then, I'll be very open about the architecture that we used and all that kind of stuff as well, so that you guys can learn, kind of how you use technology to make these things more comprehensive. Ishmael, I see you've asked if there will be a semester test. No, there won't be a semester test. There are projects that you need to complete though. So I think one of them are quite close to either just before or in semester test week. So you might just need to put some time aside to actually, plan for how you're going to manage getting that project done along with studying for your other semester tests. Cool, guys. Any other questions? Okay, while you're putting your questions into the chat, I'm just going to go over what's next. So please, once again, if you haven't joined the LinkedIn group, I've added the link again into these slides. Same with the form. I also just want to re-emphasize for those of you who might not have been on the call in the beginning, if you have a student account with Microsoft that you've used for Azure in a different project, please use this form to let us know, because it means that you're going to have run out of credits, and it means that we're not going to be able to help you, when you get to the realization that you don't have credits. We need to know now so that we can talk to the director and deputy director to help us get around that. So please go set up your Azure Students account to see if you have the credits. If you don't have the credits, finish completing this form for us so we know who we need to help out. Okay, guys, and then study smart, don't study hard. There's always a big difference between the two, and then have fun throughout the semester. All of the projects that you have, all of the things that we're asking you to do is to help you improve and get ready for industry, but we can't force you to do this, so the effort that you put in is going to be the effort that you get out. I see there's a comment here, ma'am, I did that with UiPath, I already logged into account. That's perfect. If you did it with UiPath, that's fine. That doesn't impact the Microsoft Azure stuff. The Azure account is specific to the online cloud usage that we're going to need for the web API and the web app. If you've already created the UiPath account, that's perfectly fine. You're going to need to create an orchestrator account much later in the semester as well, but it shouldn't be an issue. UiPath works separately because that's a community version. Okay, guys, any other questions? Okay, Prof. Kutsi, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add from your side before we close.
No, thank you. Not really from my side. Yeah, the main thing for me is just that you get your Azure. Students came to me in class, and then they told me that they already have used up their credits. If you don't know what we are talking about here, then you're okay, because then obviously you haven't used Azure. So there are a number of people who do not have the credits, and we really have to know about you. Otherwise, we will not be able to assist you. So that's quite important at this stage. The projects are all now on the resources tab. You can go and get them. Please read through all of them. Make a copy of it on your machine and start working on them, because project one will then cover all the 4 projects. One is project 1 doing the planning, and project 2 to 5 is then actually implementing that. Yeah, so we will be, the project due date is then 10 August, and you must get going on that. So that's all from my side. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Prof. Okay, guys, if there's any other questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat, but I think we're going to close off class. So thank you very much for attending. We'll see you again next week. Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody. So we'll upload the